November 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Obergefreiter Klaus Becker pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, feeling dampness seep through his wool uniform. The forest above was silent, too silent. No birds, no wind through shattered pines. Just laboured breathing of 12 men packed into a space designed for 8, and distant mechanical rumbling growing louder. He had fought for 3 years, Poland, France, the frozen Eastern Front. He knew the sound of artillery being positioned, but this was different. The rumble came from everywhere, as if the Americans were bringing up entire divisions of guns. "They're trying to scare us," muttered Gefreiter Hans Schmidt, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. Psychological warfare. Becker said nothing. Every instinct screamed that something unprecedented was coming. Through the observation slit, fog hung between skeletal trees. The Americans were out there, beyond the mist. 5:45. The rumbling stopped. The silence was worse than any sound. Becker watched Schmidt's cigarette smoke curl upward. Someone coughed. A young replacement whispered a prayer. Then the world exploded. The first shell hit 50 meters forward. Becker felt concussion through 3 feet of reinforced concrete. Before he could process it, the second shell landed. Then the third. Then dozens more. Then hundreds. The mathematics didn't make sense. Artillery barrages came in waves, shells arriving every few seconds as guns reloaded. But this was continuous roar, as if the sky had torn open. Bunker walls shook. Dust rained from ceiling. The electric bulbs swayed violently, casting dancing shadows across faces frozen in disbelief. Becker began counting. Force of habit from artillery observation training. 1, 2, 3, 4. 20 shells in 5 seconds, 40 in 10 seconds. He kept counting until he reached 200. 1 minute had passed. 200 shells in 60 seconds. And they weren't stopping. Schmidt's cigarette burned on concrete. No one moved. The young replacement simply stared at nothing, mouth open, overwhelmed. Outside, the forest was being systematically erased. Trees that had stood for centuries reduced to splinters in seconds. Entire sections of trench lines ceased to exist. German positions that took weeks to fortify were obliterated before defenders could return fire. The roar continued. 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The Americans weren't launching an artillery barrage. They were operating an industrial machine of destruction, each gun crew feeding shells with factory efficiency. Becker stopped counting. The numbers had lost meaning. This wasn't warfare as he understood it. This was something new, something terrible. The Americans had taken principles of mass production assembly lines that built automobiles, refrigerators, radios, and applied them to killing. This was the morning Obergefreiter Klaus Becker learned that everything the Wehrmacht taught about warfare was obsolete. The Americans weren't just fighting with more artillery. They had industrialized destruction itself, turning it into an assembly line that could rain steel on German positions at rates defying comprehension. And this was only the beginning. The German Wehrmacht entered World War II with artillery doctrine that had served them well in the Great War. Their philosophy emphasized precision over volume, quality over quantity. Each artillery mission required careful coordination through multiple command levels. A forward observer would spot a target, relay coordinates to a battalion commander, who would consult firing tables, calculate trajectories, and only then authorize fire missions. The process could take 30 to 90 minutes from target identification to shells landing. This methodical approach reflected German military culture, thorough, professional, technically sophisticated. Their guns were excellent. The 105mm LFH-18 howitzer was reliable and accurate. The 150mm SFH-18 packed considerable punch. German artillery officers were highly trained, often holding university degrees in mathematics or engineering. They took pride in their precision, their ability to place shells exactly where needed with minimal ammunition expenditure. But precision had a price. German artillery required extensive preparation, careful calculation, and centralized control. Flexibility was sacrificed for accuracy. Speed was traded for thoroughness. And as the war progressed, this doctrine would prove catastrophically inadequate against an enemy who approached the problem differently. The United States Army emerged from World War I with different lessons. American commanders had witnessed the devastating effectiveness of massed artillery on the Western Front. They understood that in modern warfare, the side that could deliver more steel on target faster would control the battlefield. The question wasn't how to make artillery more precise. It was how to make it faster, more flexible, and overwhelmingly abundant. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the artillery school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, became a laboratory for revolutionary doctrine. Officers experimented with decentralized fire control, allowing lower-ranking officers to call in fire missions without waiting for approval from battalion headquarters. They developed standardized procedures that could be executed by crews with minimal training rather than requiring mathematical expertise. The breakthrough came with the Fire Direction Center concept. Instead of each gun crew calculating firing solutions independently, a centralized FDC would compute all calculations and transmit firing data to multiple batteries simultaneously. This allowed dozens of guns to fire coordinated missions with unprecedented speed. What once took an hour could now be accomplished in minutes. But doctrine alone wasn't enough. The Americans needed technology to match their ambitions. They developed the SCR 610 radio, a frequency-modulated transceiver that allowed forward observers to communicate directly with fire direction centers. This eliminated delays caused by severed communication lines. An observer could call in fire from any position with line of sight to the target. Then came the proximity fuse, perhaps the most revolutionary artillery innovation of the war. Traditional artillery shells detonated on impact or after a preset time delay. The VT fuse variable time used a miniature radio transmitter to detect proximity to the ground and detonate at optimal height above the target. Against infantry in the open, this was devastating. A shell that would have buried itself in the ground before exploding now detonated overhead, showering fragments across a much wider area. The Americans obsessed over standardization. Every gun of the same type fired the same ammunition with the same propellant charges. Firing tables were identical across all units. Procedures were documented in field manuals that any crew could follow. This wasn't the German approach of highly trained specialists. This was industrial warfare, where any properly trained crew could operate at high efficiency. The M101 100 5mm howitzer became the backbone of American divisional artillery. Lightweight, mobile, and reliable, it could fire up to 4 rounds per minute in sustained operations. The M114 155mm howitzer provided heavier punch with similar reliability. And for targets requiring maximum destruction, the M1 240mm howitzer, nicknamed the Black Dragon, could demolish fortified positions. But the true revolution wasn't in the weapons themselves. It was in how the Americans organized them. Each infantry division included 4 artillery battalions, 3 equipped with 105mm howitzers, 1 with 155mm guns. These battalions could mass their fire on any target within range in minutes. Corps-level artillery could add even more guns to critical missions. Most revolutionary was the time-on-target mission, TOT in artillery parlance. Multiple batteries would calculate different flight times for their shells to strike the target simultaneously. Guns closer to the target would fire later than those farther away. The result was dozens or hundreds of shells arriving at the exact same moment, giving defenders no warning. The first indication of incoming fire was the explosions themselves. German artillery officers who survived the war would speak with grudging admiration about American firepower. But in 1944, as Obergefreiter Klaus Becker huddled in his bunker in the Hürtgen forest, German commanders still believed their superior training would overcome American material advantages. They were about to learn otherwise. February 14th, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Hauptmann Friedrich Werner crouched behind a rocky outcrop, binoculars pressed to his eyes as he watched American artillery batteries deploying in the valley below. As a veteran artilleryman with the Afrika Korps, Werner had spent 2 years fighting the British across the desert. He knew artillery. And these Americans looked like amateurs. Their positioning was poor, too exposed to counter-battery fire. Their crews moved without the crisp efficiency he expected from professional soldiers. When they began firing, their shells landed scattered across a wide area rather than concentrated on targets. Werner lowered his binoculars and permitted himself a slight smile. "Their guns are excellent," he told his subordinate, Lieutenant Hans Dietrich. "American manufacturing is first-rate, but their coordination is terrible. They fire like each battery is fighting its own war." The assessment seemed confirmed over the following days. German forces pushed American troops back through Kasserine Pass, inflicting heavy casualties. American artillery, while numerous, failed to stop the advance. Werner filed a report to divisional headquarters. "American artillery poses minimal threat. Superior German training and tactics will prevail." He would later burn that report. 4 months later, July 19th, 1943, Sicily. Lieutenant Dietrich, now commanding his own battery after Werner's promotion, found himself on the receiving end of American fire for the first time. His battery had set up in an olive grove near Palermo, supporting the defense against Patton's advancing 7th Army. The first American shells arrived at 0800 hours. Dietrich expected the scattered fire he'd witnessed at Kasserine. Instead, 40 shells landed within a 30-second window, blanketing the entire grove. Trees that had stood for centuries were shredded into kindling. 3 of his 6 guns were destroyed before his crews could even reach them. Before Dietrich could organize a response, another volley arrived. Then, another. The Americans were firing faster than he thought possible, and their accuracy had improved dramatically. His battery was combat ineffective within 10 minutes. When he reported the encounter to Werner, now an Oberst commanding the division's artillery, his superior officer initially dismissed it as exaggeration. "You faced naval gunfire, perhaps. American field artillery cannot achieve such concentration." But similar reports flooded in from across Sicily. American artillery was different now, faster, more coordinated, more deadly. Something had changed between Tunisia and Sicily. The answer lay in those 4 months between campaigns. American artillery units had studied their failures at Kasserine Pass with brutal honesty. Fire direction centers were reorganized. Radio procedures were streamlined. Forward observers received intensive training. The Fort Sill doctrine was finally being implemented effectively. September 9th, 1943, Salerno, Italy. Oberst Ludwig Heilmann, commanding the 4th Fallschirmjäger Division, watched from a hillside as American forces landed on the beaches below. His paratroopers were elite troops, veterans of Crete and the Eastern Front. They occupied strong defensive positions overlooking the landing zones. He expected a slaughter. The Americans came ashore under an umbrella of naval gunfire that shook the earth. Heilmann had experienced naval bombardment before, terrifying but imprecise. Ships at sea couldn't provide the accuracy needed to support ground troops. Once his men engaged the landing force, the naval guns would have to cease fire or risk hitting their own troops. But as American infantry pushed inland, the naval guns didn't stop. They shifted to targets deeper in German positions with precision that seemed impossible. Heilmann soon realized why American forward observers were directing the naval fire in real time, treating battleships like mobile artillery batteries. Then, the American field artillery came ashore. Within hours, multiple batteries were operational, and Heilmann experienced something entirely new. The Americans coordinated all their fire naval guns, field artillery, mortars, into a single integrated system. When his paratroopers counterattacked, they didn't face fire from individual batteries. They faced massed fire from dozens of guns simultaneously. "The Americans shoot artillery like we shoot rifles," Heilmann wrote in his journal that night. "Constantly, abundantly, without apparent concern for ammunition expenditure." His counterattack failed, not because his men lacked courage, but because they couldn't reach the American positions through the curtain of shells. By January 1944, at Anzio, the pattern was undeniable. Oberst Werner, now Chief of Staff for a Corps Artillery Command, compiled reports from across the Italian front. Every German unit that engaged American forces reported the same phenomenon: overwhelming artillery fire, rapid response times, seamless coordination. Werner obtained a captured American field manual on fire direction center procedures. Reading it, he finally understood. The Americans had decentralized tactical control while centralizing computational support. Any lieutenant with a radio could call in fire from multiple battalions in minutes. The FDC computed all the mathematics, allowing gun crews to focus purely on mechanical execution. It was brilliant, it was efficient, it was everything German artillery doctrine wasn't. Werner briefed his commanding general on the American system, recommending immediate doctrinal changes. The general listened politely, then dismissed the concerns. "We have trained artillerymen with years of experience. They have factory workers playing soldier. Quality will prevail over quantity." Werner knew better. He'd seen American artillery evolve from incompetence at Kasserine to devastating effectiveness in just months. They were learning faster than the Germans could adapt, and behind that learning curve stood American industrial production: unlimited shells, unlimited replacement guns, unlimited everything. In his private notes, Werner wrote a prediction: "If the Americans achieve in France what they have achieved in Italy, our forces will face artillery bombardments of unprecedented intensity. We are not prepared for industrial-scale warfare." He was right, but even Werner couldn't imagine the scale of what was coming. The lessons learned in North Africa and Italy were about to be applied with overwhelming force across northwestern Europe. And German soldiers like Obergefreiter Klaus Becker, waiting in their bunkers in the Hürtgen forest, would pay the price for their high command's failure to take American artillery seriously. The learning curve was over. The demonstration was about to begin. June 6th, 1944, 05:30 hours, Point du Hoc, Normandy. Major Werner Pluskat stood in his observation bunker overlooking Omaha Beach. Telephone receiver pressed to his ear as he tried to make his superior understand what he was seeing through the pre-dawn darkness. "The horizon is filled with ships," he said, his voice tight. "Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands." The voice on the other end was skeptical. "That's impossible. You're seeing a convoy. Probably British, heading for Le Havre." Pluskat returned to his observation port. The ships weren't moving laterally. They were positioned in precise rows, facing the shore. And behind them, he could see the flashes of naval guns preparing to fire. "They're not moving," he reported. "They're—" The first salvo arrived before he could finish. The bunker shook, dust rained from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, Pluskat watched as the entire coastline erupted in geysers of earth and concrete. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all firing simultaneously at pre-planned targets along the Atlantic Wall. This was artillery on a scale Pluskat had never imagined. Not guns being aimed and fired individually, but an entire fleet transformed into a single weapon system. each ship assigned specific targets, all coordinated through radio networks. The naval bombardment continued for 90 minutes. Then came the landing craft. As American infantry waded ashore, Pluscat expected the naval guns to cease fire standard procedure to avoid hitting friendly forces. Instead, the fire shifted inland, creating a moving curtain of explosions that advanced ahead of the American troops. Forward observers were directing the battleships in real time, treating 14-inch naval rifles like mobile howitzers. Within hours, American field artillery was coming ashore. Pluscat watched through binoculars as gun crews deployed their pieces within minutes of landing, setting up fire direction centers in waterproof tents while still under German mortar fire. The guns began firing before the crews had even dug proper emplacements. By noon, multiple American artillery battalions were operational on French soil. Pluscat's battery attempted counter-battery fire and was immediately silenced by overwhelming return fire. He counted at least 30 American shells for every German round fired. Over the following weeks in the Norman bocage, the dense hedgerow country inland from the beaches, American artillery doctrine evolved even further. Each hedgerow became a miniaturized battlefield, with German defenders occupying strong positions in the thick vegetation and ancient earthworks. The Americans developed a simple, devastating response. Forward observers accompanied every infantry platoon. When a hedgerow was occupied, the infantry would call in artillery rather than assault directly. Within minutes, sometimes seconds, shells would saturate the German position. Only after the barrage would American infantry advance. Feldwebel Otto Carius, a decorated tank ace, experienced this firsthand when his panzer unit was caught in the open near Carentan. "We could handle their tanks," he later wrote. "We had superior armor, superior guns, better trained crews, but we could not handle their artillery. They called down fire on us faster than we could maneuver. Within 10 minutes, we lost 4 tanks without ever engaging an American armored vehicle." The daily ammunition expenditure told the story. A single American infantry division in Normandy fired more artillery shells in one day than some German divisions received in a month. The Americans weren't conserving ammunition, they were spending it freely, knowing more would arrive tomorrow. And every tomorrow, more did arrive. July 25, 1944, Saint-Lô, France. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzer Lehr Division, stood in his command post, reviewing the morning intelligence reports. His division was considered one of the finest in the Wehrmacht, superbly trained, well-equipped, combat-experienced. They held defensive positions south of Saint-Lô, blocking the American breakout from Normandy. Bayerlein knew the Americans were preparing an offensive. His reconnaissance had reported troop concentrations, supply build-ups, and increased artillery activity. But the Panzer Lehr had defended against numerous attacks since D-Day. They would hold. At 1100 hours, the American artillery preparation began. The first shells arrived without warning, a time-on-target mission that put dozens of rounds on Panzer Lehr's forward positions in the same instant. Before Bayerlein could process what was happening, the second volley landed, then the third. The bombardment wasn't coming in waves. It was continuous, overwhelming, apocalyptic. But this was just the beginning. At 11:30 hours, the heavy bombers arrived. Over 1,500 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds carpeted a rectangular zone 5 miles wide and 1 mile deep with high explosive and fragmentation bombs. The ground shook for miles. Trees were uprooted. Vehicles were tossed like toys. Men simply disappeared. When the bombers finally departed, leaving a moonscape of craters and shattered equipment, Bayerlein expected a pause, time to reorganize, time to assess damage. Instead, the artillery resumed. For 2 more hours, American guns poured shells into the devastated zone. Fire direction centers coordinated hundreds of guns in a precisely choreographed symphony of destruction. The bombardment moved methodically across Panzerlehr's defensive network, systematically destroying everything in its path. Bayerlein tried to move his tanks forward to counterattack positions. American forward observers spotted the movement within minutes. Artillery fire found his panzers before they could deploy. He watched helplessly as his most powerful weapons, the Tigers and Panthers that should have dominated any battlefield, were destroyed by shells fired from guns they couldn't even see. By 1400 hours, when American infantry and armor finally advanced, the Panzerlehr Division effectively no longer existed as a fighting force. Of approximately 5,000 men, at least 2/3 were casualties. 70% of vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Command and control had completely broken down. The artillery was hell, Bayerlein would later testify. We had experienced Russian artillery on the Eastern Front. We had endured British bombardments in North Africa. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared us for what the Americans could deliver. It wasn't a battle, it was industrial-scale annihilation. The Americans didn't just use more artillery than the Germans, they used it differently. German doctrine called for artillery preparation before an attack, then cessation of fire once infantry advanced. American doctrine treated artillery as a continuous supporting arm that never stopped. As infantry moved forward, the artillery fire rolled ahead of them like a curtain, suppressing any German position before it could engage. Forward observers, with American units, could call in fire missions in under 3 minutes. This 9-to-1 time advantage meant American units could respond to threats almost instantly, while German forces operated in slow motion. The breakthrough at St. Lo became a rout. German forces that had held the Americans in check for weeks suddenly collapsed. Not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because American artillery had destroyed their positions, severed their communications, interdicted their supplies, and shattered their will to fight. Operation Cobra demonstrated what happened when American artillery doctrine reached full maturity. The lessons learned in Tunisia, refined in Sicily, perfected in Italy, had been applied with overwhelming force in France, and German commanders finally understood what Oberst Werner had warned them about. They were fighting an industrial power that could produce artillery ammunition faster than Germany could produce artillery pieces. And in that equation, there was no path to victory. November 16, 1944, Hürtgen Forest. The bombardment that had awakened Obergefreiter Klaus Becker continued for 3 hours. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. Becker emerged from the bunker into a landscape transformed beyond recognition. The forest that had provided cover and concealment was gone. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to jagged stumps. The ground was a moonscape of overlapping craters. Entire sections of trench line had simply ceased to exist. His company of 120 men had been reduced to 37 effective soldiers. Not from direct assault, the American infantry hadn't even reached their positions yet. The artillery alone had destroyed 2/3 of his unit. Over the following weeks in the Hürtgen forest, this pattern repeated daily. American forces would identify German positions, call in artillery, and systematically obliterate them before infantry advanced. The dense forest that should have favored defenders became a death trap. Artillery shells detonating in the tree canopy created airbursts that showered fragments over wide areas. There was no safe place. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front claimed Russian artillery was worse. Those who had fought only in the West knew better. The Russians fired massive barrages, yes, but they were sporadic, poorly coordinated, often aimed at area targets rather than specific positions. American artillery was different, precise, relentless, responsive. Forward observers could adjust fire in real time, walking shells onto targets with terrifying accuracy. Then came December 16th, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West. The initial German attack achieved surprise and made significant gains, But by the second day, American artillery began to respond. Units that had been pushed back reorganized quickly, largely because their artillery remained intact and operational. While German panzers advanced, American guns retreated in good order, setting up new firing positions and continuing to deliver fire. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division found itself surrounded by German forces. The paratroopers held defensive positions around the town, but their real strength was artillery. The division's artillery battalions, supplemented by separate artillery groups, created an impenetrable defensive ring. German units attempting to assault the town were destroyed before they could close with American positions. Oberst Werner, observing the battle from Army Group B headquarters, watched as German offensive momentum bled away under relentless artillery fire. Supply columns were interdicted, assembly areas were bombarded. Counterattacks were broken up before they could form. The Bulge offensive failed for many reasons: fuel shortages, Allied air superiority once weather cleared, lack of strategic depth. But artillery played the decisive role. American units could call in fire support faster than German units could maneuver. Defensive positions that should have required infantry assaults to capture were simply obliterated by artillery. By January 1945, as German forces retreated from the Bulge, the lesson was complete. American artillery superiority wasn't just about having more guns or more ammunition. It was about having a system doctrine, technology, training, and industrial capacity that integrated all these elements into an overwhelming advantage. German soldiers had learned what Obergefreiter Klaus Becker learned in his bunker on November 16th. When American artillery spoke, courage and skill meant nothing. Only concrete and luck could save you. And concrete could only take so much. The Fire Direction Center was the invisible heart of American artillery superiority. While German gun crews calculated firing solutions individually using slide rules and trigonometry tables, American batteries relied on centralized computation that transformed artillery from a mathematical challenge into a mechanical process. Inside, a typical FDC, often just a tent with maps and plotting boards, a team of 6 to 8 men could coordinate fire from multiple batteries simultaneously. When a forward observer called in target coordinates, the FDC would plot the location, calculate range and deflection, adjust for weather, and transmit firing data all within 2 to 3 minutes. The system used graphical firing tables rather than mathematical computation. Operators would align strategies on plotting boards, read values from pre-calculated charts, and transmit standardized fire commands. This meant crews required training rather than mathematical expertise. A high school graduate could learn FDC procedures in weeks, while German artillery officers needed years of technical education. Communication was equally revolutionary. The SCR 610 radio allowed forward observers to talk directly to fire direction centers without laying wire. When observers spotted targets, they could call in fire missions immediately. German observers relied on field telephones with vulnerable wire lines often severed by artillery fire. The FDC system enabled time-on-target missions, the signature American artillery technique. Multiple batteries would calculate different flight times, so shells arrived simultaneously. A target might be engaged by 6 batteries from different locations, with all shells landing within a 5-second window. The first indication of incoming fire was the explosions themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Powell, commanding an artillery battalion in France, summarized the advantage. "We could mass fire from 6 battalions in 3 minutes. The Germans needed 30 minutes minimum. By the time their shells arrived, we'd already moved." American artillery superiority rested on a foundation of ammunition abundance that German forces could scarcely comprehend. While Wehrmacht units carefully rationed shells, measuring expenditure by the round, American batteries fired thousands of rounds daily without concern for conservation. The numbers told the story. In 1944, American factories produced over 40 million artillery shells. German production, hampered by bombing and resource shortages, managed approximately 10 million. This 4-to-1 advantage in production translated directly to battlefield superiority. But production was only part of the equation. The Americans had built a logistics system capable of delivering ammunition from factory to gun in weeks. The Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system, moved 12,500 tons of supplies daily to frontline units. Ammunition dumps were positioned close to artillery batteries, sometimes within miles of the front lines. Quality control was rigorous. Every shell was manufactured to precise specifications, ensuring consistent performance. Propellant charges were standardized, allowing gun crews to use the same firing tables regardless of ammunition source. This standardization meant any shell would perform identically to any other of the same type. American ammunition dumps near the front represented more shells than entire German armies possessed. A single core-level ammunition supply point might hold 50,000 rounds or more. Division artillery could requisition ammunition freely, limited only by transportation capacity rather than availability. German soldiers captured near Bastogne expressed shock at American ammunition expenditure. One Obergefreiter, interrogated about artillery fire, stated, "They shoot more shells in one barrage than my battery received in 6 months. How can anyone fight against such abundance?" The answer, increasingly clear by late 1944, was that they couldn't. Material superiority, on this scale, transcended tactical skill or strategic brilliance. When one side could fire 10 shells for every enemy round, the outcome was predetermined. The proximity fuse, officially designated VT fuse for variable time, was perhaps the most revolutionary artillery innovation of World War II. Traditional shells detonated either on impact or after a preset time delay. Both methods had limitations. Impact fuses buried shells in the ground before detonation, reducing effectiveness. Timed fuses required accurate range estimation and failed if calculations were wrong. The VT fuse solved both problems through elegant engineering. A miniature radio transmitter in the shell's nose broadcast a signal as it flew. When the return echo indicated proximity to the ground, the fuse detonated automatically at optimal height, typically 15 to 30 feet above the target. Against infantry in the open, the effect was devastating. Shells exploded overhead, showering fragments downward across a wide area. Soldiers in foxholes, protected from ground bursts, were exposed to airburst fragmentation. Studies showed VT-fused shells were 3 to 5 times more effective than conventional ammunition against personnel. The Americans guarded the technology obsessively. VT fuses were initially used only over water or where duds couldn't be recovered. By late 1944, restrictions were lifted. During the Battle of the Bulge, VT fuses proved devastatingly effective against German infantry concentrations. Oberst Georg Bruchmüller, a World War I artillery expert, examined reports of the new fuse. His assessment was grim. They have achieved what we only theorized. This technology makes their artillery essentially unstoppable. German soldiers called them the shells that think. They were right to be afraid. The psychological impact of American artillery bombardment manifested in what German medical officers called artillery neurocen, artillery neurosis. It was different from combat fatigue caused by infantry fighting. Soldiers could adapt to rifle fire, even machine guns. They could take cover, return fire, feel some sense of control. But against massed artillery, there was nothing to do but endure. German military medical records from late 1944 show dramatic increases in psychological casualties. Soldiers exhibited tremors, inability to speak, paralysis without physical injury. Some became catatonic during bombardments, unable to move even when their positions were being overrun. Others deserted, preferring court-martial to another day under American guns. Captured mail from German soldiers revealed the psychological toll. A Gefreiter writing to his family in December 1944, "We can fight the Americans when we see them. But the shells come from nowhere, constantly, without warning. You cannot be brave against something you cannot fight." Veterans of the Eastern Front found Western Front artillery worse than anything they'd experienced against the Soviets. The Russians fired massive barrages, yes, but they were episodic. American artillery was relentless. It fired continuously, methodically, like a machine that never tired. Desertion rates among German units facing American forces increased dramatically in late 1944. Wehrmacht investigators attributed much of this to artillery rather than ideological collapse. Soldiers weren't abandoning belief in Germany, they were fleeing an experience that broke human endurance. Elite units weren't immune. Waffen-SS formations, paratroopers, and veteran divisions all showed increasing psychological casualties. The mental fortitude that had sustained them through years of fighting couldn't withstand industrial-scale bombardment that could arrive at any moment, for any duration, with crushing intensity. The Americans had weaponized not just steel and explosives, but psychological terror through sheer volume and relentlessness. German commanders attempted numerous tactical adjustments to counter American artillery superiority, but each solution created new problems that ultimately proved insurmountable. Dispersed formations reduced casualties from individual barrages, but decreased unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. Companies spread across wider frontages couldn't mass firepower for counterattacks. Communication between dispersed elements became difficult, especially when American artillery severed telephone lines. Deeper bunkers offered better protection, but became tombs when hit directly. 3 feet of reinforced concrete could withstand near misses, but direct hits from 155mm shells or heavier weapons collapsed even the strongest fortifications. Soldiers trapped in collapsed bunkers often suffocated before rescue. Camouflage and concealment helped initially, but American aerial observation spotted positions despite German efforts. Artillery observers in spotter aircraft could direct fire onto camouflaged positions within minutes of detection. Night movement became standard procedure to avoid observation, but this slowed operations fatally. What could be accomplished in hours during daylight took entire nights. German forces operating on nocturnal schedules surrendered initiative to Americans who moved freely during day. Counter-battery fire targeting American guns proved ineffective due to ammunition shortages and inferior fire control. German batteries that revealed positions by firing were immediately engaged by overwhelming return fire. The exchange ratio heavily favored Americans. They could afford to trade shells, Germans couldn't. Every tactical adjustment reduced effectiveness in other areas. German forces were adapting to survive rather than win, trading offensive capability for defensive endurance. By late 1944, German High Command could no longer ignore the artillery crisis. Field reports from every front told the same story. American artillery was breaking German defensive positions faster than they could be reinforced or rebuilt. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, submitted a stark assessment to OKW in November 1944. His report noted that American artillery superiority alone was sufficient to guarantee Allied victory, regardless of German tactical skill or soldier quality. He recommended abandoning forward defensive positions and conducting a fighting withdrawal to Germany's industrial heartland. Hitler rejected the proposal. OKW attempted to redirect production priorities toward artillery and ammunition, but by late 1944, Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under Allied bombing. Even if priorities shifted, factories couldn't produce enough shells to match American expenditure rates. General der Artillerie Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Operations at OKW, documented the situation in reports later captured by Allied forces. His analysis was brutally honest. German artillery doctrine, designed for short, decisive campaigns, couldn't compete against American industrial warfare that treated ammunition as essentially unlimited. At Nuremberg, several high-ranking officers testified about artillery disparity. Warlimont's testimony was particularly revealing. "We lost the war to American industry, manifested most clearly in their artillery. They could fire 10 shells for every German round. Against such material superiority, tactical brilliance was meaningless." Hitler's response was to blame commanders for defeatism and order impossible counteroffensives. The disconnect between leadership and battlefield reality was complete. The industrial gulf between American and German artillery production was staggering. In 1944, American factories produced over 40 million artillery shells across all calibers. German production, hampered by strategic bombing and resource shortages, managed approximately 10 million shells. This 4-to-1 ratio translated directly to battlefield dominance. Artillery piece production told a similar story. The United States manufactured approximately 18,000 field artillery pieces during the war years. Germany produced roughly 12,000. But American guns received abundant ammunition, while German pieces sat idle for lack of shells. Quality control standards differed dramatically. American shells were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, ensuring consistent performance. Every propellant charge was identical. German production, increasingly desperate by late 1944, sacrificed quality for quantity, and still couldn't match American output. Raw material availability highlighted the disparity. The United States had unlimited access to steel, copper, explosives, and other essential materials. Germany faced critical shortages of everything. By 1945, German ammunition used substitute materials that reduced effectiveness. The numbers were devastating. America could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Industrial capacity determined outcomes before battles were fought. Organizational differences multiplied material advantages. Each American infantry division included 4 artillery battalions, 3 with 105 mm howitzers, 1 with 155 mm guns. Total, 48 guns at divisional level, with additional corps and army-level artillery available for major operations. German infantry divisions typically fielded 36 artillery pieces of mixed calibers. But by late 1944, many divisions operated far below authorized strength due to losses and production shortfalls. Ammunition allocation revealed the doctrine gap. American divisions received daily allotments measured in thousands of rounds per gun. German divisions received monthly allocations that American units would expend in days. A single American corps conducting a major offensive might fire more shells in 24 hours than the entire Wehrmacht received in a week. Response times demonstrated tactical superiority. American forward observers could call fire missions in under 3 minutes. German procedures required 30 to 90 minutes, a 10 to 30-fold time disadvantage. Training hours told another story. American artillery crews received hundreds of hours of instruction before deployment. German crews by late war received minimal training before combat. Experienced German artillerymen were irreplaceable casualties. American losses were quickly filled with well-trained replacements. Post-war analysis revealed artillery's decisive role in Allied victory. Studies estimated that 60 to 70% of all combat casualties in the European theatre resulted from artillery fire, higher than any previous conflict. German casualty reports, captured intact from several divisions, showed artillery caused approximately 75% of their losses in engagements with American forces. Infantry, small arms, and tank fire combined accounted for less than 25%. Time to suppress metrics demonstrated American efficiency. Fire direction centers could deliver suppressive fire on newly identified targets in under 5 minutes. German forces required 30 minutes minimum to organize effective return fire, by which time American infantry had often already advanced through suppressed positions. Cost-effectiveness ratios favored artillery overwhelmingly. Artillery could destroy targets at fraction of the cost of aerial bombardment or armored assault. A single artillery battalion conducting a 10-minute fire mission could deliver effects requiring dozens of aircraft sorties or multiple tank companies. Area denial capabilities proved equally important. American artillery could interdict German supply routes, assembly areas, and rear positions continuously. German forces learned to avoid any location within artillery range during daylight hours. This forced nocturnal operations that slowed German responses fatally, while Americans operated freely around the clock. Obergefreiter Klaus Becker survived the Hürtgen forest. Captured in January 1945 near the Ruhr River, he found himself at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where American interrogators were compiling assessments of German military capabilities. When asked about his combat experience, Becker spoke at length about American artillery. His testimony, preserved in captured prisoner interrogation reports, revealed the psychological transformation that exposure to American firepower had produced. We were told that German soldiers were superior, better trained, better disciplined, more courageous, Becker stated, and perhaps that was true, but it meant nothing against their artillery. You cannot be brave against something you cannot fight. You cannot use discipline to stop shells that rain from the sky for hours without pause. Asked to estimate American shell expenditure during the November 16th bombardment, Becker's response was telling, "I stopped counting after 200 shells in the first minute." The mathematics became meaningless. It wasn't artillery as we understood it, it was industrial production applied to killing. Other prisoners echoed similar themes. A lieutenant from the 12th SS Panzer Division, "We fought with courage and skill. They fought with factories and railroads. We couldn't kill them faster than America could replace them. We couldn't destroy their guns faster than their factories could build new ones." The testimonies revealed not bitterness toward American soldiers, but recognition of systemic superiority. German prisoners understood they hadn't been defeated by better warriors, but by better logistics, better doctrine, and overwhelming material abundance. American artillery veterans viewed their role with professional pride, tempered by recognition of their advantages. They understood they'd possessed resources German forces could only dream about. Staff Sergeant Robert Miller, Fire Direction Center operator with the 4th Infantry Division, reflected in a 1982 interview, "We knew we had every advantage. Unlimited ammunition, excellent equipment, thorough training. But that didn't make the work easy. Coordinating fire from multiple batteries under combat conditions required intense concentration. The psychological burden of distance killing affected some crews. Unlike infantry who saw their enemy face to face, artillery crews killed at ranges measured in miles. Shells disappeared over the horizon. Impact was abstract coordinates on a map, confirmation from forward observers, occasionally smoke rising in the distance." Captain James Harrison, Battalion Fire Direction Officer, acknowledged the moral complexity. "We fired thousands of rounds. Each one was aimed at human beings, even if we never saw them. You tried not to think about it during combat. Afterward, some men struggled with what we'd done. Others took pride in supporting infantry and saving American lives. Most veterans emphasized professionalism over triumphalism. They'd executed doctrine effectively, used resources efficiently, accomplished missions successfully. That American industry had provided overwhelming material superiority wasn't something individual soldiers controlled, they'd simply done their jobs." Lieutenant Colonel David Patterson, commanding an artillery battalion in France, summarized the prevailing attitude. "We had every advantage except experience, and we gained that quickly. The Germans were skilled, but skill alone couldn't overcome the system we'd built." American artillery doctrine developed during World War II became the foundation for modern NATO fire support systems. The fire direction center concept, refined through combat experience, remains standard worldwide. Digital fire control systems used today are direct descendants of the graphical methods pioneered at Fort Sill. The principle of massed fires, concentrating multiple batteries on single targets, dominates contemporary artillery planning. Time on target missions, revolutionary in 1944, are routine procedures in modern artillery operations. The integration of forward observers with maneuver units, once novel, is now fundamental doctrine. Precision has replaced volume in modern warfare, but the underlying philosophy remains unchanged. Artillery exists to deliver overwhelming firepower faster than enemies can respond. GPS-guided munitions and computerized fire control have made artillery even more responsive and lethal than their World War II predecessors. The Soviet Union, observing American artillery effectiveness, adopted similar centralized fire control and massed fire doctrine in the Cold War. Modern Russian artillery doctrine still reflects lessons learned from studying American operations in World War II. Former enemy nations adopted American methods. The West German Bundeswehr, rebuilt in the 1950s, used American artillery doctrine and training methods. Japanese Self-Defense Forces artillery organization mirrors American structures. The lesson transcended specific technologies or weapons. Systematic thinking, standardized procedures, and industrial-scale logistics could transform any weapon system into decisive force. American artillery didn't just win battles in World War II. It established principles that define fire support operations 8 decades later. The thunder from Hürtgen Forest echoes still. October 19, 1984, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The trees had grown back, thick and green, reclaiming land that had been moonscape 40 years earlier. But the scars remained. Craters still dotted the forest floor, some 20 feet across and 8 feet deep, testament to the weight of American shells. Klaus Becker, now 68 years old, stood at the edge of one such crater. His granddaughter had driven him from Hamburg for this visit. She didn't understand why he wanted to return to this place, but she'd agreed when she saw the look in his eyes. An American approached James Patterson, 66, wearing a veteran's cap from the 4th Infantry Division. He'd been a young artillery officer in 1944, coordinating the fires that had fallen on this forest. The two men had corresponded for 3 years through a veterans' reconciliation organization. Now they met for the first time at the place where their war had intersected. Neither spoke immediately. They stood together at the crater's edge, two old men who'd been enemies, looking at evidence of what American industrial power could accomplish when applied to destruction. Finally, Becker broke the silence.